Good morning, gang. How are you wonderful humans doing this fine day? And by fine day, I mean drizzly day here in wet and wild Leeds. Just thought I'd touch base. Said I was going to commit to doing more vlogs, as the kids say, around my training, my nutrition and stuff. So just an update really. Last couple of days I have been water loading, so powerlifting competition this Sunday. Weight's still kind of holding where it was, coming down a little bit slowly, but obviously I've been increasing my water intake significantly. So I thought might be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the principles around, I guess, weight cutting in general. Last weekend, for example, I had 5 athletes competing in weight class sports, mostly professional boxers. So there's different approaches that we can use to cutting weight. I think the heart of all of that and the key determinant in terms of what we need to look for really is, doing it safely. There have been some ridiculous water manipulation, dehydration approaches. I don't remember if you've ever seen the old series of like The Ultimate Fighter, where they'd be like dragging people in and out of sauna, or like at death's door trying to make weight. I think the culture around that is changing slowly. I think there's the UFC Fight Center and stuff as well. They're doing a lot of research into it. There's more publications coming out now in boxing and other sports. I think there's more academics and scientists who understand the impact of extreme dehydration and extreme water cutting practices on the body in terms of risk to health. I'm not going to go too much into those risks today, but just to put it down into its simplest form, obviously if we're reducing water volume in the body, we become dehydrated. That's going to drop blood pressure, put extra stress on our internal organs. Through dehydration, depending on the type of practices as well, that can also mess up our electrolyte levels, which means that not just in the water cutting process, but actually in the rehydration process as well, things can go wrong there if we're not getting the ratios of those electrolytes to our fluids correct. Again, I always said that this vlog wasn't going to be too technical, so I might do a post of that on my Instagram, which I'll post my handles below. So I tend to do more of my technical stuff there as well, my infographic type things. This is a bit more discussional. So I'm going to keep this discussional and just talk about some real, I'm going to say generalized rules for this as well. So please remember that everyone's going to have a slightly different individual response, slightly different experiences, slightly different physiological starting points, and also tolerances to this kind of approach. So when we're talking about water manipulation, weight cutting, really as a general guideline, and I'm talking very generally here as well, that if someone's got more than 5% of their initial body weight to drop, it's probably going to require, some form of medical supervision or expert supervision. And that's where the risks of like really low blood pressure can kind of kick in. It's probably something as well where if you are in a weight class sport, you're probably going to be looking at day before weigh-ins. Anything I'd say above 3-4% of body weight losses, of total body weight losses in equivalent. So if you weigh 100 kilos, and you've got to lose 5 kilos or more, for example, you're probably going to be looking at doing day before weigh-ins, or at least having a good period of time before you weigh in. Why is that? Well, obviously weight cutting takes a lot of stress, puts a lot of stress on the body as it is, but our resources are obviously going to be very depleted to make that much weight. So, we're going to be dehydrated. We're probably going to be in a low glycogen state, which means that we're always going to be limited by how quickly we can put food and fluid back into our system. And that is limited. So, for example, if we've depleted glycogen and the associated water with it, for a bigger guy, that might be several hundred grams of carbohydrate we need to put back in to get their glycogen levels fully restocked. If we can only absorb, optimistically 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour, which is what the literature kind of points towards, obviously that means that person might take 10, 11 hours to get in sort of 800, 900 grams of carbohydrates. Same with fluid. We can only take on board, everyone's got a slightly different tolerance, of course, slightly different rates of uptake, but usually, between 700 and 900 mils an hour, depending on what literature you read, is what we can take on board. So getting the hydration back in and the fluids back in shouldn't be too much of an issue if we've got several hours. For same day weigh-ins, it's more the fueling as well. And obviously we don't want to be underfueled, But just because we can put the fuel and fluid back in doesn't mean that that kind of approach doesn't also put a lot more physiological stress on the body. So for example, if we have to deplete glycogen, let's talk about why we might deplete glycogen. Well, we deplete glycogen because glycogen obviously has got weight within itself, but there's also a lot of associated water with that. So for every gram of glycogen we hold 2 to 3 grams of water with that. So if our body stores, say, 700 grams of glycogen in total, that means that could be 2-3 kilos that we could drop straight away by depleting our glycogen stores, using up that extra water that's released from that, and then, making weight that way. But that means we've got to put it back in. But the stress of having to deplete glycogen, and I'll talk about glycogen depletion in a second, the stress of having to deplete glycogen, and then also, if we are doing things like water loading protocols as well, which might just disrupt sleep, and if we're waking up in the night to go to the bathroom, so on and so forth, might mean that even though you can put that back in theoretically, that the body is then going to need probably a good full day's rest, good full day's sleep. It's not going to be a nice fun day's eating to put all that back in. And then you run the risk as well, if you overcook it, particularly with things like electrolytes, of the body holding onto that excess water, having that kind of edema. I've seen it happen before where people have tried to refuel too quickly and they've ended up with like really severe swelling at their joints and cramping and things because their electrolytes are all off and out of whack. So like I was saying, as a general rule, if someone's got over 5% of body weight to drop, it should really be day before weigh-in. If you're getting up towards 10%, seriously medical supervision, it can be done, but it's just not recommended. So medical supervision will be checking things like hydration status, blood pressure, heart rate, ECG, stuff like that, to make sure it's done as safely as possible and to have the required medical tools to deal with anything that does go wrong. Okay. Now, anything less than 5%, there's an argument that could be made for saying you can do it on a same day weigh-in, but like I've just explained there, it might not be the most sensible thing to do. And anything where the weigh-in is going to be a couple of hours before, 2 to 3% of body weight is fine. Now, what I am going to caveat with this is smaller athletes obviously are going to have to dehydrate themselves or reduce water or glycogen to get as a relative percentage of their body to a higher extent to get the same amount of actual weight loss. So obviously 5 kilos on a 60 kilo athlete is very different to 5 kilos on a 100 kilo athlete. The 100 kilo athlete's got more body water, total body water, more glycogen, so on and so forth. However, if we think about the percentage perspective, smaller athletes can get away with a higher percentage drop even within a same day weigh-in. Why might that be? Well, if you think about what we've just discussed there, which is that our digestion of food and fluids is limited, but it's fairly similar across different body sizes. Or if it isn't the case, I've not seen any literature to suggest that. Maybe I'll look into it and figure that out. But basically, if we can at least appreciate that we're going to have a physical limit on how much food and fluid we can get in, obviously, if we're thinking about carbohydrates, it's going to take much less carbohydrates to restock a 60 kilo athlete than it is a 100 kilo athlete. It's going to take much less fluids to replace body water as a percentage of total body water in a 60 kilo athlete to a 100 kilo athlete. So lighter athletes can get away with weighing in a little bit closer at the same relative amount of body water loss. So I hope that makes sense. But that doesn't mean we should do it. And then I guess the next thing really is talking about approach. So what I've done this week, I'll just talk to you about what I've done initially. Now, I've had to do some coaching sessions this week that I've been involved in. So I've been on my feet. I've been joining in with a few light sessions. So I would say that these will classically be seen as like glycogen depletion sessions. Any kind of strength training will deplete glycogen. One of the things you have to be aware of though is if we're doing strength trainings that like access those energy systems that are going to use glycogen significantly, is that even though we're breaking down glycogen into maybe things like lactate is then recycled in our kidneys, in our liver through a thing called the Cori cycle, which then means that our blood glucose, just because we're burning those calories doesn't necessarily mean all of that. Burning that glycogen and those calories doesn't necessarily mean that some of that isn't recycled back into glycogen. So we can significantly deplete glycogen, but we tend to find we get a big drop and then it kind of levels off over time. So if we're going to try and fully deplete glycogen, that's probably going to require some form of higher intensity activity. So it might be running at a certain intensity or a certain threshold. It might be doing like circuit training type stuff, or it might be, you know, lots of even heavier but a higher volume strength workout. The problem with that, as you can see, is if we're doing that too close to competition, is that's going to be fatiguing as well. So the advantages of what we would call, this will be called active weight cutting. So active weight cutting means there's some form of attempt to move and deplete glycogen, is that if we're depleting glycogen, that also releases water, which means we've got more body water that we can get rid of. But it also means that because that water is being released, it has less of an effect on things like our blood pressure, which is going to potentially have negative health consequences. The negative aspect of active forms is that obviously you're going to be depleting glycogen, so therefore we've got that to worry about topping up. Have we got the time to do it? And also the physiological stress we're putting on the body, particularly if it's done quite close to competition. If we then do an active form of glycogen depletion and we want to keep our glycogen levels low once we've got that drop, that also then means for that week into competition, we are likely to need to be following a fairly low carb diet. Okay. Now, low carb, I don't mean necessarily zero carb, but low carb can be relative to the individual, their training demands. You know, if I'm working with a fighter, for example, and let's say they're fighting on a Saturday and they've got their last pad session on, say, a Tuesday or Wednesday, we might use that session to then deplete their glycogen stores. And what you can then do is combine that active water depletion, glycogen depletion, and water losses. And what would be then done is obviously you're going to be sweating through those sessions. So you will see this quite often where people might do their last session or whatever on the pads or on the bags with wearing a sweatsuit. So they're releasing the glycogen, they're depleting the glycogen, releasing the water, and then that water is being lost in some form of sweat. Now, the problem with doing that is then if we're doing that to lose the water weight, but then we're doing something like water loading, that kind of negates the effect anyway. So we have to be careful about what strategies we use and that they don't conflict with each other. So for example, there's no point if you're fighting on a Saturday, on a Tuesday, doing a session in a sweatsuit if you're then doing a water loading approach. You might as well just do the session, deplete your glycogen stores, go lower carb to keep that lower, keep through a water loading approach, and then when you pull back from the water, then you will then obviously then that water weight will drop down, but the glycogen will already be low. So typically speaking, what you will find is like active forms where we combine glycogen depletion and exercise. It might not necessarily be that the active form is to do glycogen depletion. It might just be to get our heart rate up and sweat more. So for example, if an athlete hasn't got access to, say, a hot environment, a hot bath, a steam room, sauna, something like that, they might then say go for a walk on a treadmill in a sweatsuit, because that is active, but what we're trying to do is get our core temperature up to cause sweating, so therefore that we lose water that way. Now, that still comes with some form of physiological stress. Like, it's difficult if we've had a tough week's training or a tough training camp, to then even, you know, get up and go for it, get sweaty or whatever. But it might be, you know, I've had stories of, not my athletes, but people I work with who've had like fighters be flown out to other countries to put in a hotel room, and literally there's no bath, the showers are cold, so they've had to kind of, you know, they've had to make do with these active forms of sweating, which isn't exactly ideal when you want an athlete to be resting. But if they've got to make weight, they've got to make weight. But it is just about, you know, making sure that we're as prepared as possible for that. So for example, this weekend I'm going away. I've made sure the hotel has got a hot bath, for example. So if I do want to get a hot bath to drop a couple of pounds in water through a passive form, then that's what I can do. So my approach has been early glycogen depletion during the week. I've been water loading as well. So why do we water load? Well, as we increase our water intake, our body then starts to go, okay, we're hyperhydrated. We've got too much water. We need to get rid of some of that to maintain our electrolyte balance. So what we do is we increase hormones that just push water out of the body, push water out of the body, push water out of the body. We start, you know, maybe I'd say between 5 and 7 days out. Again, there's an individual response with this. Some people respond to water loading really well, some people don't. And typically speaking, what we're looking for a water load is, in my experience, I mean, maybe the figures are a bit skewed in the literature, but in my experience, we might be getting 1 to 2% of body weight drop just using this approach. So what we do is we start our water loading on around about 40 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. So for me, as an 80 kilo athlete, that would be about 3.5 liters. And then over the next few days, we increase that by 5 to 10 milliliters per kilogram. up until, around about 50 to 60 millilitres per kilogram. So my top of my water load will be around about 60 millilitres per kilogram, which at 80 odd kilos comes out at about 5 and a bit litres. 4 and a bit, 5 and a bit litres. I've got the numbers written down. I should have just had them there, shouldn't I? But anyway, that's the general guideline. There's guidelines out there. Again, I'll do an infographic on this, spelling all this out in detail. Now, water loading is perceived as being fairly safe unless we go excessive. I've heard some protocols of people pushing in like 8, 9, 10 litres of water a day. That's where we risk hyponatremia. So hyponatremia is where we have so much water that our electrolyte dilution is just so small that then starts to affect nerve function, cause heart attacks, things like that, extra pressure on the body, and yeah, it's not a good place to be as well. So this is where there's a few debates come in. It's like, should we keep electrolytes in? So things like sodium will increase water retention and hydration, but if we deplete sodium, then when we're restocking or if we push our water too high, there's a risk there. So if you are going to do this kind of approach, I think it's important, one, to practice, and two, to just be aware of these things and get in the right support in order to help you make weight safely. Personally speaking, I'm not necessarily a fan of dropping sodium for that reason. So I tend to keep sodium fairly constant in myself and in my athletes, because again, I don't want to be this sodium depletion, especially if there's active forms of sweating going on as well. Because obviously if we're sweating, or even if there's passive sweating, like using a hot bath, there is a risk there that we're depleting sodium as well as increasing water, okay? Again, the body should let us know if there's a problem there, but if we're aware of what the problem is, then we know what the solutions are. So that's why monitoring needs to be put in place. So I've depleted glycogen over the course of the week with a few sessions. I've been water loading to get this bounce back effect of, as our water increase intakes, we get an increase in hormones that are, that cause diuresis, pushing out water out of the body. And then when I pull back, at some point this evening, it will then mean that my body keeps excreting water, and then my body will obviously then reduce its net water level. So my total body water percentage will drop as a result of that. And then it's just a case of just monitoring where my weight is. Now, once I've gone through that, I've got my active forms of glycogen depletion and the associated water availability is increased. Then I've now water loaded. That means that, and water loading would be classified as like a passive form of weight cutting, water cutting, simply because it's passive, there's no activity involved. Then all that leaves me with really, is either still more passive activity, so running in a sweatsuit type stuff, walking in a sweatsuit type stuff, or more passive approaches. Glycogen depletion, if we were to just do it through a low carb, would technically be passive. See the lines blur on some of this stuff, it depends on what your definitions are. Then that really leaves me with going into Saturday. My weigh-in's on Sunday. Now, I'm just going to put this important point here. Most people, when they water load, will pull back the night before an event. For me personally, my body holds a lot of water and excretes it out for many, many, many hours afterwards. I know this because I've done this before when I used to be a bodybuilder. So for me, I hold water quite significantly. So I have to put my water intake a little bit higher, and I tend to find that my body flushes it out. Some people, it might be 6 or 7 hours they get this diuresis effect, increased diuresis effect. For me, it will be the full next day. So I will still be consuming water that next day. Like after I pull back tonight, I will still be consuming water tomorrow, but very small amounts, knowing that it takes that amount of time to push the water out. So you have to know your athlete. You have to know your own response on this as well. So that's why I'm doing it then. And then all that will be left for me to do is I have two options. I've just got basically either active forms of sweating, sweatsuit, walking around. Don't want to do that. It's been quite a stressful week. Or it will be passive forms. So passive at this point will be things like saunas and hot baths, okay? Obviously, that comes with a couple of different bits of risk. So if we're using heat and we're sweating profusely and rapidly, that is going to drop blood pressure potentially quite quickly. Heart rate's going to go up. If heart rate goes up, the reason for that is simply because our blood pressure is dropping and our body is now struggling to pump oxygen and blood around the body, okay? So we just need to be aware of that. So if you're going to use any form of passive weight cutting, I would say that you can lose a significant amount of water weight, but that comes with a significantly increased amount of risk. I tend not to need to like to push things too hard with that as well. So I would hope that through glycogen depletion and water loading, I might get, say 3% of that body weight loss. And that last couple of percent, that last maybe 2 kilos maximum for me personally, I will do passive. I can handle that. My blood pressure doesn't drop. Now, obviously, if we're in a hot environment, we're sat down in a bath or in a sauna, and our blood pressure starts to drop, that's going to increase our risk if we stand up too fast of orthostatic hypertension, which is when we get that head rush. It's also going to increase our risk of having, we've got that heat stress as well as dehydration stress, fluid loss stress. So we have to be very careful that we're monitoring ourselves. So if you are going to use an approach like that, at least have somebody around, and at least make sure that it's not something like ridiculous amount of weight you're trying to do passively. However, let's just flip this on its head as a bit of general advice. So when I'm making decisions with athletes, this is kind of all of the equations that I've got moving around in my head. If I've got an athlete that's got, say, 1 or 2% of body weight to drop and a very close weigh-in, I know for a fact that we can probably put their water back in sufficiently. And if they've got a training week the week before, so a lot of amateur athletes will compete throughout the year, so they'll just be train, competition, haven't really got time to affect their training. So we might not use glycogen depletion, so we'd use more passive forms, hot baths, sauna, to get that 1 to 2% of body weight off to make weight. But that also means that for a lot of amateurs, it means that they need to stay focused on having a consistent body weight around the year. Now, a professional athlete who's got a day before weigh-in, who we know is going to ramp up their training volume and then taper down into competition, hopefully, if they've got good strength and conditioning and coaching advice, although yeah, there's some issues around culture and that in fight sports. Then we might glycogen deplete in that last week, we might water load with them, we might then use those active and passive forms as well. We've got more tools in the toolbox, depending on how big they are, how much time they've got to refuel, and obviously their experiences and their responses to that. I've got some people that I've worked with where we've just done trial runs with hot baths and they just get really lightheaded. So we have to think about if we're going to use that, risk versus reward. They just feel uneasy. They just don't regulate their temperature very well. On that note as well, our sweat glands do hypertrophy. So if it's an approach that you want to try and take, it's probably worth practicing, not necessarily in terms of doing the water cut and depletion, but just spending some time in hot environments. So, like getting saunas, having regular hot baths on a weekly basis, your sweat glands will hypertrophy and we get better at sweating. One of the adaptations to endurance training in the heat is just that. We sweat better, which means we lose more water and more electrolytes potentially, but we also then get better cooling effects as well. So yeah, that's why that's an advantage. People might go, sweating more is a bad thing. No, sweat is a good thing. It's an important physiological response for keeping our core temperature within normal constraints so we can function. However, it does come with the caveat as that the more efficient we are at that, then the more efficient we have to be in terms of our food and our fueling, and that's a limiting factor on performance. But that's a different conversation for a different time. So I think that went on a bit longer than I intended to, but I think that covers some important points there. So all I've got left to do now is my glycogen's depleted. I'm water loading now for the rest of today, peeing frequently, hence I'm a bit tired because I've been up through the night going to the bathroom. Today, I'm going to just keep my carbs quite low, go to a mostly like high protein, high fat. Notice I said carbs, not calories there. I don't need to drop any more body fat at this point. It's not going to happen. I'm pretty lean as it is. And then I will pull back on water this evening. Tomorrow, I'll just monitor that through the day, see how I'm going. And then I'll travel to, I'm staying in a hotel the night before. Night before, I'll check my weight. I'll take my scales with me and then I'll see where I'm at. And then probably I'll try and get maybe a hot bath or two done before I go to bed tomorrow night, so that I'm going to bed around about 500 grams, a pound above my weigh-in weight, because I know typically I drop that amount of weight overnight. So that's another key point to get into if you are involved in weight class sports or working with weight class athletes, is start getting into the habit of weighing them of a morning and of a night before they go to bed. So you've got a good idea of how much water weight they're losing overnight. Respiration requires us to produce water, which is a good thing. So we tend to drop water weight overnight. And again, that can be influenced by the humidity. If an athlete's traveling, it can be influenced by the environment that they're sleeping in. So probably tomorrow night, what I'll do is I'll make sure that the room's nice and warm. I'm wrapped up nice and toasty so that I get that little bit of extra heating. So my body's got that bit more of a cooling effect. Needs to lose a little bit more water weight. Right. So that's me. Next update will probably be on Sunday morning from the competition. So thanks for tuning in again, guys. These videos are getting longer and longer and longer when I was trying to get them shorter and shorter and shorter. But hopefully that was useful. Have a great day, have a great rest of your week, and I'll speak to you all soon. Peace.